Thank you for coming to my session. My name is Danny Heber. I'm a postdoctoral scholar at the University of Alberta. My project focuses on just how flexible are parts of speech across different languages. So this project is a quantitative corpus-based study of lexical flexibility. This is sometimes called polyfunctionality, polycategoriality, conversion, zero derivation. There are as many names for this as there are scholars who study it. This project's based on my dissertation research. I'm working it into a research article. And I define polyfunctional lexical items as lexical items that appear in more than one discourse function, so reference, predication, or modification. You might think of noun, verb, adjective, with no overt coding of that function, so no overt derivational morphology, for example. An example of this from Nuuchahnulth that you can see here on this slide. So in these three examples, you have the stem meaning to, and it gets used for reference in the first example, predication in the second example, and modification in the third example. So this is the type of thing I'm interested in, is when you have that same stem that can be used for multiple discourse functions. And I'm interested in looking at just how frequently this happens within a language and across languages, and trying to quantify that. There's been some previous research done on this, but not a great deal. So Croft in 1984 looks at Russian roots and finds that the roots are least morphologically marked when their semantic category aligns with their discourse function. Can in 1985 finds that 3.2% of English words are created by a conversion. Evans and Osada look at two different samples for Mondari, which is very famously kind of featured in this literature on lexical flexibility, and then finds that 72% of stems can be either, or between 52% and 72% can be used as both noun or verb, depending on the sample you're looking at. And Mithun 2017 finds that 12% of roots in Central Alaska Yupik can be used as either noun or verb. So the data for this study, I looked at just two languages. I looked at English and Nuuchahnulth because both of these have featured very prominently in the discussion of lexical flexibility. English is often described as a highly flexible language, and other times it's described as a highly rigid language. And Nuuchahnulth is one of the most discussed languages. Certainly it's part of one of the most discussed language families, Wakashan, in the literature on lexical flexibility. So I used a corpus of Nuuchahnulth texts by Toshihide Nakayama that he put together, about 8,300 tokens. And I used the Open American National Corpus for English, which was about 3.2 million tokens. And what I did is I annotated each of the lexical items I was interested in for its discourse function. Only 0 marked forms were included. And for Nuuchahnulth, this was the entirety of the corpus. And for English, this was about 380,000 tokens. And I came up with a scale from 0 to 1 to rate just how flexible each lexical item in these languages are, using Shannon's H, which is a measure of diversity or entropy. So you can kind of see like how that's quantified. So on the left, you see a perfectly, actually I mixed these up, excuse me, you see a perfectly flexible language on the left where the functions are distributed across all of its uses very evenly, and a perfectly rigid example on the right where all of the uses are one discourse function for that lexical item. So when I annotated for that and got a distribution of those diversity ratings, they looked like this, with English on the left and Nuuchahnulth on the right. As you can see, for many, many lexemes in both languages, there was no functional diversity at all. The functional diversity rating was 0. But for English, there was actually a fair number that did have some range of functional diversity. And while many in Nuuchahnulth, Nuuchahnulth simply didn't have the frequency levels that we would need to get a really good assessment of lexical flexibility for a lot of these lexical items. Nonetheless, the ones that we were able to get, or I say we, I mean I, were able to get a solid lexical flexibility rating on, nonetheless showed actually fairly high lexical flexibility rating of about 0.6 rather than like 0.2 as we found in English. And so when you put each of these lexical items on a ternary plot like this is the result. And in a ternary plot, we see, it indicates the ratio of 3 different variables as points on an equilateral triangle. So each point in these plots represents one lexical item. The closer a lexical item is to one of the corners, the higher the proportion of its uses are for that function. So a point that's directly in the middle of the plot would have an equal distribution of its uses across reference, predication, and modification, whereas one that was all the way in the bottom left corner and say reference would just be, all of its uses would be for reference. So as you can see, the two languages distribute very differently in terms of how frequently their items are used for each of these three functions. English tends to strongly associate lexical items with a single discourse function. However, all lexical items in the survey showed at least some lexical flexibility, and the greatest degree of flexibility was between reference and modification. So these data present a more complicated picture of English than is usually claimed. In Nuuchahnulth, most stems, or the stems that do occur with enough frequency to get a solid flexibility rating, have a fairly high flexibility rating of 0.6. And most Nuuchahnulth stems lie somewhere on a spectrum between reference and predication, and there's a relatively smooth climb of types between that. Stems are almost never used for modification, however, a fact that's probably due to a lack of a dedicated morphological construction for modification. And finally, this was kind of more of a kind of offhand observation. I didn't do this with any sort of statistical rigor, but I noticed a few semantic patterns in the data, specifically that human animates were consistently less functionally diverse in both languages. They're almost always used for reference. And English and Nuuchahnulth have opposite behaviors in terms of their quantifiers and property words. English quantifiers and property words have very low functional diversity. They're always used for modification, whereas Nuuchahnulth have very high words in Nuuchahnulth have very high functional diversity. They're used for any range of reference to predication and actually not used very frequently for modification. And this difference is likely because Nuuchahnulth lacks a dedicated morphological construction for modification. So this project introduces a method for how to measure the functional diversity of a lexical item or a morpheme. And I think the data show nicely that lexical flexibility is really a matter of degree and varies not just by language, but by individual lexical items. Both English and Nuuchahnulth display a significant degree of lexical flexibility. Nuuchahnulth just simply significantly more so than English, but would be wrong to discount the flexibility that English does show. And languages also differ in the way that flexibility is realized. So English, each lexical item kind of centers around a functional prototype, whereas Nuuchahnulth, there's a lot more flexibility, but that flexibility is almost entirely on the reference predication axis and very little on the modification axis. So they're also qualitatively different in how that flexibility is realized. So this data, I think, gives a nice kind of empirical backing to a lot of the work that has already been done and claimed about English and Nuuchahnulth, but does it in a more comprehensive way. It kind of gives greater weight to some of the intuitions we have, and now we can say we have some data to put behind those. So thank you very much for watching my talk, and I'd love to answer any questions you have.